China now. Privacy is a big issue, of course, in terms of so many people's data, and China is accused of a malign attack on Britain's democratic institutions. It has apparently hacked the details of 40 million voters. Well, joining me now to discuss this is the former Downing Street Director of Communications and Senior Advisor to Boris Johnson, Guto Harri. Guto, thank you so much for joining us today. How worried are you about China's malign attack, apparently, after the hack on the Electoral Commission?
I think it's clearly very worrying if anybody's interfering with the rules of the game, because if the rules of the game are compromised, then the outcome of the game is disputed, and then you undermine the whole basis of the legitimacy of government in the UK. So it's very serious indeed. I will say, though, Peter, that I think we do need a sort of sense of reality and perspective about China. We need to recognize that this is a major force for the rest of my life and the rest of all our lives over the next few decades. And so very well to express concerns when something like this happens. I've no doubt at all they are a serious threat and that they spy on us as we presumably spy on them. But it's the only conversation that we're having at the moment about China is this: China, the bogeyman, has done something bad. Let's try and get back to where we were when David Cameron was Prime Minister, in the early days when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, some of the things that James Cleverly said when he was Foreign Secretary. We have to recognise the reality and deal with this major economy, this military power, and this cultural influence in our lives, frankly.
I agree with you that we do need reality and perspective, but we also need values, and we also need to say this far and no further. But it is, as you sort of intimate there, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Guto, but we have to deal with China, don't we? We have to deal with them as a trading partner, as a diplomatic partner, and so on. But when they do things like this, when they do these huge hacks, when they spread disinformation, when they ban some of our MPs like Ian Duggan-Smith, even our security minister, Tom Tugendhat, from setting foot on Chinese soil, you can understand why people say, actually, maybe we should be a bit harsher with them.
Absolutely. But the answer to that is to walk the walk, not talk the talk. And often, the people who are sort of loudest, and, I'm not sure that Oliver Dowden is going to be that reassuring figure at the dispatch box this afternoon. I've met some of the people on the fringes of our security services, and they are far more reassuring, but they don't go out there and sort of poke the bear, if you like. They just try and work hard behind the scenes to make sure that our technology catches up with this. They are frankly, technologically, steaming ahead at the moment in China. And so what we need to do is a little less rhetoric, a lot more focusing on what we need to do to fund our security services properly, to make sure that we produce the right technical graduates, that it's worth their while, some of them, to go into working for the country, not for working for private companies, and deal with this as grown-ups, not just lash out and sort of smash around with rhetoric. I think we've got to get back to being serious people at the moment in public life. And it's not helpful to me to sort of lash out in public against some sort of bogeyman. Let's match them, let's outmaneuver them, let's be cleverer than them diplomatically, and let's get ahead of them technologically.
You talked there about military intelligence, Guto. You talked about defence, and I wonder, given that Grant Shapps, for example, and many other people within the defence establishment and other politicians have said that defence spending should be higher. We're not going to outspend China on defence spending, but as you say, a lot of defence spending and military intelligence spending is not just about sort of tanks and planes, it's about people sitting behind desks and working in the cyber side as well, and that has to be a huge growth area.
There's a line in one of the recent Bond movies where, I can't remember his name now, but he basically says, I can do more damage in my pajamas with a laptop than you can with your gun, Bond. And that is true certainly at the moment. I'm not sure how often we're going to need a tank, but you can rest assured that cyber attacks, and at the moment it looks like destabilizing, maybe prying, maybe spying, but there is the potential to using cyber attacks to actually shut down traffic lights, to render hospitals incapable of operating, to do enormous damage to the City of London. All of this is no longer the stuff of sci-fi and fantasy. And so if we were to take the threat properly seriously, we would be talking less and beavering away harder behind the scenes. And I'm not sure that the people who are beavering away behind the scenes and do manage against the odds often enough to recruit the most exceptional graduates to sacrifice, the money they could make in the private sector in order to operate for king and country, that we need to give them the tools that are needed to stay ahead of the game. And this is always going to be a race. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to move on. We're never going to be able to rest on it. We've got to keep it up. But in the meantime, the politicians would be more helpful if they were trying to give China less reasons to laugh at us, not take us seriously, and to sort of perhaps feel more malign towards us. I think a little bit of good cop, bad cop. The politicians should be the good cop. Let the professionals do the work of keeping China properly technologically and in terms of espionage in check.
One huge advantage we have over societies like China is free speech, is freedom of assembly, is being able to say what we think. But there's a fascinating report out today by Dame Sarah Khan, which I think may well have been commissioned actually when you were in government, or around that time anyway, Guto, when you were advising Boris Johnson, which is about the fact that 76% of people, just one of the findings, 76% of people feel that they can't say what they really think. They're self-censoring, they're not putting their views out there. What do you make of that, which has come not as a result of, but nonetheless in the wake of the scandal and the incredibly awful mob protests over the teacher at the Batley Grammar School who showed a picture of Mohammed?
It's a really interesting piece of work, and it's a serious piece of work, and it recognises the nuances and the subtleties that are often missing from the debate. So I think it's a great basis on which to proceed, because we can be simplistic on both sides. When you say I've got freedom, one of the great democratic freedoms is the freedom to protest, the freedom of assembly and all that. So that needs to be protected. But none of these freedoms are absolute. And so your freedom or your right to assemble and your right to protest should not include doing it in the immediate vicinity of a school where you intimidate people who are not old enough to vote, not to mention any other considerations, children, with a sort of very intimidating kind of view of the world. Now, the origins of this, as you rightly say, it came because a teacher was trying to sort of intellectually engage children in the concept of blasphemy. What is blasphemous? What is not? Whether blasphemy can be intellectually justified or not. And he showed a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I call that intellectual exchange. I call that education. I call that training young minds. And you should be able to do that, not in other countries. If they choose to do things differently, good luck to them. But it's part of our tradition that our freedom is the freedom to think different thoughts and to think outside the box. And what has happened now is that we do need to reassert the rules of the game. Because if the rules of the game means that we're so tolerant that we allow people in who are intolerant, then there's a paradox there, that our tolerance leads to less tolerance because the intolerant people take advantage of our tolerance.
Have you self-censored, Guto? Have you sort of thought, I know you're someone not short of an opinion, but have there been times where you have said, actually, I'm not going to put that on Twitter, I'm not going to say that in the context of a public meeting or in a workplace? How have you been? Are you part of the 76%, I suppose?
I'm sure that every single one of us, now avoid saying some things that we may have said 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Definitely. And in many cases, that's a good thing, because there were different norms, when I was at school, and there were jokes that would be regarded as, racist, misogynist, homophobic, and all the rest of it now. And, a lot of people rightly had to sort of, rein themselves in. But we all know people. And yeah, maybe we do sort of think, oh, I can't really say that. And not saying things that are offensive, as in you're calling names or you're being rude about somebody else, but you're putting forward a point of view that is entirely legitimate, that other people can disagree with you over. But if you look at the trans debate, virtually everyone I've ever met is terrified of dipping their toe into any considerations there, even though it involves things like giving very, very radical drugs to young people under the age of consent, under the in the mid-flow of puberty. There's been very little debate on that. There's been a change of policy recently, but most people have been scared of engaging in it, and that cannot be healthy in a democracy either.
I totally agree, and we're going to talk about Scotland and its views on not just that issue, but on hate speech in general over the next day or two. I just wonder if you could give me your thoughts as well politically on the fact that Reform UK are doing very well and in some constituencies are beating the Conservatives, certainly in the opinion polls anyway. Obviously, things will probably look very different when it comes to the election in terms of how many seats Reform can actually win. But there's no doubt that they are doing much better than they were previously, and this is feeding in to the many, many problems the Conservative Party has.
It is, but, I'm very clear on this. The Conservative leadership should, and I think do, worry a lot more about the fact that the Labour Party, by moving away from its extremes, is way ahead of the Conservatives, not snapping at their heels, but 20 odd points ahead and reaching towards, what looks like a massive victory in the next general election. I don't think it needs to be like that. But the target should be, what is it that they are saying that makes people who obviously voted Conservative at the last election want to switch over to them, not look to the fringes that Labour has rightly moved away from, and to think, how can we appease that 10, maybe 15% at a push out there? Because you head out to that fringe and you're leaving the centre of the pitch wide open. And Reform are not going to form the next government. I'm not sure that I can predict that much, but I would bet my house that Reform will not be forming the next government in the United Kingdom.
Would you bet your house that there won't be
let's put them in perspective.
Would you bet your house there won't be a Conservative recovery before the next election? Is there any way to turn things around or make things less bad? I mean, some people say the polls might narrow a little bit before the next election, or is this just terminal decline for Rishi Sunak's Conservatives?
I think it's almost very, very simple, and yet it's proving frustratingly elusive. In Rishi Sunak, though I have issues with the way he became leader, but we have a man who is clean living, hardworking, understands global finance, economics, and technology, the three biggest things that offer the main opportunity for economic growth and the improvement of public services. And if he had behind him a united team, determined to take the game to the opposition, not to trip themselves off and be sent to the sin bin, then we would have more than a fighting chance of, a decent performance in the next election, and maybe even, deny victory to the other side or even scrape a win. What is not happening at the moment is that Rishi Sunak, not perfect, of course, and people around him, we can always do better. When you're on the inside, it's always hard. But the main issue and the main challenge for Conservative sort of performance worthy of the history of the party in the next election is the seemingly insatiable appetite of the Parliamentary Conservative Party to self-harm. And if they just get with the programme, support their leadership, give him a fighting chance, and give the lineup that we have a fighting chance in the next election, then it's definitely not over.
Guto Harri, thank you very, very much indeed.